The floor was cold beneath Elena's knees, and every eye in the great hall was fixed on her. Moments ago she had been standing tall beside the throne, the Luna of the Moonfire Pack, wife to Alpha King Damien. Now she knelt on the polished stone, her silver gown pooling around her, while Celine stood above her wearing a smile that did not reach her eyes. "Kneel," Damien had said, and the word had cracked through the hall like a whip. Elena had not moved at first. She had thought she misheard him. Surely the man she had married, the man she had stood beside through 5 long years of war councils and treaties and sleepless nights, would not say such a thing to her in front of 300 wolves from every royal house in the kingdom. But he said it again, louder, his golden eyes hard as stone. "Kneel before Celine. She carries the true mate bond. You will show her the respect owed to the future Luna of this pack." The hall had gone silent, except for the soft crackle of the torches along the walls. Elena felt every gaze pressing into her skin, some pitying, some hungry for the scandal, a few burning with quiet outrage they dared not show. She looked at Damien, searching his face for some sign that this was a mistake, a cruel test, anything but what it appeared to be. She found nothing. His jaw was set. His eyes did not waver. So she knelt. She did it slowly, with a grace that made the humiliation somehow sharper, as though she refused to let them see her stumble, even as they watched her fall. Her knees met the cold floor. Her spine remained straight. Her chin did not drop. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her break, even as something inside her chest cracked wide open. Celine stepped closer, her heels clicking against the stone with unhurried confidence. She wore red, a deliberate color against the pale blues and silvers of the Moonfire Court, a color that said she did not belong here, and did not care. She reached out, and rested 2 fingers under Elena's chin, tilting her face upward, forcing their eyes to meet. "You understand now," Celine said, her voice pitched just loud enough to carry, "that some bonds cannot be denied, not even by a Luna." Elena said nothing. She had learned, over 5 years in this court, that silence could be its own kind of armor. She let Celine's words hang in the air unanswered, and she watched something flicker across Celine's face when the silence did not break the way she had hoped it would. Not fear, not shame. Just a terrible, unreadable stillness. Around them, murmurs rippled through the gathered wolves. An older man in the deep green robes of the Ashwood pack shifted uncomfortably, his hand tightening on his cup. A young woman near the back covered her mouth. Even Damien's own advisors, men who had sworn loyalty to him since he was a boy learning to shift under his father's watchful eye, exchanged glances that spoke of unease they would never voice aloud. Damien did not seem to notice, or if he did not care. He stood with one hand resting on the arm of his throne, watching the scene he had created as though it were a piece of theater he had commissioned. There was something almost satisfied in the set of his shoulders, the way a man looks when he believes he has finally solved a puzzle that had troubled him for years. Elena rose when Celine finally released her chin. She rose without being told to, without asking permission, and the movement itself felt like a small rebellion. She smoothed the front of her gown with steady hands. She did not look at Damien. She looked instead at the long aisle stretching from the throne to the great doors of the hall, and she began to walk. Her steps were unhurried. Each footfall echoed against the stone, deliberate and even, a rhythm that refused to reveal the storm building beneath her calm exterior. The crowd parted for her the way water parts around a blade, some wolves lowering their eyes out of respect that no longer had anywhere proper to land, others staring openly, drinking in the spectacle of a Luna's public fall from grace. She heard Damien's voice behind her, sharp and commanding. "Elena." She did not stop. "Elena, I am not finished." She reached the great doors. 2 guards stood at attention on either side, young men she recognized, men who had sworn their loyalty to her, as much as to Damien. Their eyes met hers for the briefest moment, and she saw something there that steadied her, a flicker of loyalty that had not yet been extinguished. She gave them the smallest nod, and they pulled the heavy doors open without hesitation, without waiting for the king's permission. The night air hit her like cold water, and for a moment she simply stood on the wide stone steps outside the hall, breathing it in, letting it clear the ringing in her ears. Behind her, the doors swung shut, muffling the low murmur of the court that had resumed the moment she left, already dissecting what they had witnessed, already deciding what it meant for the balance of power in the kingdom. Elena walked down the steps into the courtyard, past the fountain that had been a gift from her own birth pack when she married Damien, past the gardens she had planted with her own hands during her first spring as Luna. The moon hung high and full above the towers of Moonfire Castle, indifferent to everything that had just happened beneath it. She did not cry. She had promised herself long ago, during the early difficult years of her marriage, that she would not give anyone the satisfaction of her tears, not even in private, not even when no one was watching. Instead, she walked to the low stone wall at the edge of the garden, the one that looked out over the valley where the pack's territory stretched for miles in every direction, and she gripped the cold stone with both hands. 5 years. 5 years she had given to this pack, to this man, to this kingdom that had just watched her kneel, like a servant, before a woman who had been in Damien's life for barely 3 seasons. She thought of the nights she had stayed awake with him, helping him draft treaties with neighboring packs, softening his sharper instincts with careful diplomacy, standing beside him when his own counsel doubted his judgment. She thought of the battles she had helped him avoid through patient negotiation, the alliances she had built brick by careful brick. None of it, apparently, had mattered in the end. A soft sound behind her made her turn. It was Grace, one of her personal attendants, a young woman, with kind eyes, and a habit of appearing exactly when she was needed most. Grace carried a cloak, which she draped gently over Elena's shoulders without a word, understanding instinctively that no words were needed yet. "They are still talking in there," Grace said quietly after a moment, glancing back toward the castle. "About what happened." "Let them talk," Elena said. Her voice came out steadier than she expected, though something in it had changed, hardened, in a way that surprised even her. "My lady, are you?" "I am fine, Grace." Elena turned back to the valley, watching the distant lights of the pack's village flicker in the darkness. "I am simply thinking." Grace did not press further. She knew Elena well enough to recognize when silence was a kindness rather than a rejection. She stood a respectful distance away, keeping watch, while Elena's mind turned over everything that had happened, searching for some thread of understanding in the wreckage of the evening. It was not only the humiliation that troubled her, though that alone would have been enough to shatter most people. It was the calculation behind it. Damien was not a man given to cruelty for its own sake. He was ambitious, sometimes cold, often too focused on the wider chessboard of pack politics to notice the smaller costs of his decisions, but he was not deliberately cruel. For him to force her to kneel in front of the entire court, in front of every royal house that mattered in the Wolf Kingdoms, meant that something larger was at play. He was making a statement, and Elena intended to understand exactly what that statement was meant to accomplish. She thought of Celine, of the careful timing of her arrival 3 years ago, of how quickly she had woven herself into the fabric of Damien's inner circle. She thought of the meetings Elena had been quietly excluded from over the past year, the decisions made without her counsel, the slow erosion of her influence that she had noticed but dismissed as the ordinary friction of a long marriage. She saw it now with painful clarity. It had not been ordinary friction. It had been a campaign, patient and deliberate, and she had walked through most of it without seeing the shape of the trap closing around her. A distant howl rose from the forest beyond the castle walls, long and low, answered a moment later by another. The pack's night patrol, checking the borders as they did every evening. Elena listened to the familiar sound, and felt something settle inside her, a strange calm arriving in the place where panic might have been expected instead. She was not going to beg for her position back. She was not going to fight Celine for scraps of Damien's attention, or plead with him to reconsider his cruelty. Something in her, some quiet certainty she could not yet name, told her that pleading would accomplish nothing, that the path forward lay somewhere else entirely, somewhere she had not yet allowed herself to look. "Grace," she said finally, turning away from the valley, "have my things gathered quietly, nothing that will draw attention. I will need to leave before dawn." Grace's eyes widened slightly, but she did not argue. "Where will you go, my lady?" Elena considered the question for a long moment, looking up at the moon, the same moon that had witnessed every wolf's transformation for as long as their kind had existed, the same moon that had watched kings rise and fall throughout the long history of the Packlands. "I don't know yet," she admitted, "but I know I cannot stay here. Not after tonight. Not while they believe I will simply accept whatever they decide to give me." Inside the castle, the sound of the court's murmuring conversation had grown louder, punctuated now by Damien's voice rising above the rest, sharp with irritation, though whether at Elena's departure or at the whispers now spreading through his own court, she could not tell. She did not care to find out. Grace hesitated at the edge of the garden. Your family, my lady, your birth pack, would they take you in? Elena's expression tightened, almost imperceptibly. Her birth pack, the smaller and weaker Holomere pack, had married her to Damien, as a political arrangement, meant to secure protection from Moonfire's much larger territory. Returning to them in disgrace, stripped of her title, would only weaken them further, and expose them to exactly the kind of predatory politics that had made the marriage necessary in the first place. That path was closed to her, as surely as if a door had been shut and locked. No, she said quietly. I will find another way. She did not know, standing there in the cold garden with the castle's golden windows glowing behind her, like distant, indifferent stars, that the answer she sought was already written into her blood, waiting patiently for the right moment to reveal itself. She only knew that the woman who had knelt on that stone floor an hour ago was not the same woman who now stood at the garden wall, staring out at the dark valley with something like resolve hardening in her chest. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the eastern hills, Elena was gone from Moonfire Castle, and the court that had watched her kneel would spend the coming weeks wondering exactly where she had disappeared to, and exactly what it would mean for all of them when she returned. 3 days before that night in the Great Hall, Elena had stood in the same garden, with a cup of tea going cold in her hands, watching Damien argue with his counsel through the study window. She remembered thinking, even then, that something had shifted between them, though she could not name exactly what. He had grown distant, in ways that felt deliberate rather than accidental, as though he were practicing for a conversation he had not yet worked up the courage to have with her directly. She thought back further, to the early days of their marriage, when Damien had been a different man, or perhaps simply a man who had not yet been reshaped by 5 years of holding a crown that demanded constant vigilance. He had been 26 when they married, newly crowned after his father's sudden death, uncertain of his footing among the older alphas who doubted a young king could hold the Moonfire territory together. Elena, only 22 herself, had been sent from Holomere with instructions to be useful, to be quiet when necessary, and firm when required, to help secure a peace that her own pack could never have won through strength alone. She had expected, in those early months, to feel like a stranger in her own marriage, a political tool, passed from one household to another. Instead, she had found, gradually and to her own surprise, something like genuine partnership. Damien listened to her counsel, even when it contradicted his instincts. He credited her publicly when her strategies succeeded, a rare gift from a young alpha, eager to prove his own competence. There had been nights, in the first 2 years, when they sat together over maps and treaties until the candles burned low, arguing and laughing in equal measure, building something that felt, to Elena at least, like the foundation of a real life together. She wondered now whether any of that had been real, or whether she had simply been useful for as long as usefulness was required. Celine had arrived during the 3rd year, sent as an envoy from the Silverfang territory to the east, ostensibly to negotiate trade rights along the northern border. Elena remembered the first time she saw her, standing in the receiving hall with an easy confidence that seemed designed to draw every eye toward her. She was beautiful, in a way that felt calculated, every gesture and expression measured for maximum effect. Elena had not been threatened by her at first. She had seen many ambitious wolves pass through Moonfire's halls over the years, each hoping to gain some advantage through charm or flattery, and she had learned to recognize the pattern without being troubled by it. What she had not anticipated was how patient Celine would prove to be, how carefully she would build her position over months rather than weeks, how skillfully she would make herself indispensable to Damien's counsel on matters of trade and border security. By the time Elena recognized the pattern for what it truly was, Celine had already secured a permanent place in the Moonfire court, invited to remain as a liaison between the two territories, her presence justified by genuine diplomatic value that made her impossible to dismiss without cause. Elena had raised concerns once, quietly, in the privacy of their chambers. She remembered Damien's response with painful clarity now, the way he had waved away her worry with an easy laugh, telling her she had nothing to fear from a woman who was simply doing her job well. She remembered believing him, or wanting to believe him badly enough that she stopped watching as closely as she should have. The changes had come slowly after that. Meetings she used to attend began happening without her, first occasionally, then regularly, always with some reasonable explanation offered after the fact. Decisions about the pack's northern trade routes, decisions she had once helped shape, were made and announced to her only once they were already finalized. She told herself it was simply the natural evolution of a growing kingdom, that Damien could not consult her on every matter as the territory expanded, that her reduced involvement reflected the demands of a busy court rather than any deliberate exclusion. She saw now, standing at the edge of a decision that would reshape her entire future, how thoroughly she had deceived herself. The morning after the Great Hall, Elena rode north with Grace and 2 trusted guards, men whose families had served the Hollowmere Pack for generations, and whose loyalty ran deeper than any oath sworn to Moonfire's throne. They traveled light, avoiding the main roads where word of the previous night's events might already be spreading among the merchants and travelers who carried news between territories faster than any messenger. "Where are we going, my lady?" one of the guards asked as they crested a hill overlooking a wide river valley, the morning mist still clinging to the water below. Elena considered the question for a long moment before answering. "To my grandmother's old cottage, near the eastern border. It has been empty since she passed, but it still belongs to my family. No one will think to look for me there." The guard nodded, satisfied with the destination, though Elena knew the truth was more complicated than a simple hiding place. Her grandmother, Beatrice, had been a keeper of old stories, a woman who had spent her long life collecting the histories and legends of the wolf kingdoms that most modern packs had allowed to fade into forgotten folklore. Elena had spent summers with her as a child, listening to tales of the first Luna, the founding mother whose bloodline was said to hold authority older and deeper than any Alpha King's crown, though the stories had always felt like nothing more than comforting bedtime fiction, the kind of tale every pack told its children to explain why the old laws mattered. She had not thought of those stories in years, but something about the events of the previous night had stirred a memory she could not quite place, a sense that there was more to her own history than the simple political marriage she had always believed defined her place in the world. They reached the cottage by late afternoon, a small stone structure nestled at the edge of a forest that had grown wild and unkempt in the years since her grandmother's death. Elena stood in the overgrown garden, memories washing over her of childhood summers, spent chasing rabbits through these same trees, of evenings by the fire listening to Beatrice's stories, while the wind howled outside. Inside, dust covered every surface, but the cottage remained largely as she remembered it. Grace set about clearing the main room, while Elena wandered through the small collection of rooms, running her fingers along shelves lined with old books and journals her grandmother had kept throughout her long life. In the back bedroom, tucked beneath a loose floorboard that Elena remembered discovering as a child during a game of hide-and-seek, she found a wooden box she had never dared to open, respecting even then some unspoken understanding that it belonged to secrets not yet meant for her. She sat on the edge of the dusty bed and opened it now. Inside lay a collection of documents, some so old the ink had faded to near illegibility, others more recent, written in her grandmother's careful hand. Elena lifted the topmost page and began to read, and as she did, the quiet certainty that had settled over her the previous night in the garden began, for the first time, to take a shape she could almost understand. The documents spoke of a bloodline, traced carefully across generations, connecting her grandmother's family, and therefore Elena herself, to a lineage the old stories called the First Luna's descendants. According to the careful notes her grandmother had compiled over decades of quiet research, this bloodline had once held authority that superseded even the crown of any individual pack, a power recognized by ancient law across every territory in the wolf kingdoms, though the knowledge had been deliberately suppressed and forgotten over centuries, as individual alpha families consolidated their own power and had no interest in acknowledging a rival claim to authority. Elena read late into the night, Grace bringing her tea she barely touched, the guards standing quiet watch outside as the moon rose full and bright over the forest. By the time she finally set the papers down, her hands were trembling, not with fear but with something closer to disbelief giving way, slowly and reluctantly, to a dawning recognition that everything she had believed about her own life might have been built on an incomplete understanding of who she truly was. She thought of the mark on her left shoulder, a pale crescent-shaped birthmark she had carried since childhood, one her grandmother had always regarded with unusual interest, though she had never explained why. She thought of the strange, momentary flare of warmth she sometimes felt in that same spot during moments of intense emotion, sensations she had always dismissed as nothing more than imagination. For the first time in her life, she began to wonder if there was more to that birthmark than she had ever allowed herself to consider. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, and somewhere in the distance, a lone wolf howled at the full moon, a sound that seemed, in that quiet moment, less like an ordinary night call, and more like a question waiting patiently for its answer. A sharp knock at the cottage door pulled Elena from her research just after midnight, and every instinct in her body went taut with alarm. Grace appeared in the doorway of the back bedroom, her eyes wide, one hand already reaching for the small blade she kept hidden in her sleeve. The guards outside had gone silent, which worried Elena more than any shout would have. "Stay here," Grace whispered, moving toward the front of the cottage. Elena did not stay. She followed quietly, gathering the wooden box of documents against her chest, ready to defend what she had just discovered, with whatever strength she could summon. When Grace opened the door a crack, lantern light spilled across the face of an old man standing on the step, his hair silver, his frame stooped with age, but his eyes remarkably sharp and alert. "Forgive the hour," the man said, his voice carrying a formal, careful quality. "I am called Arthur. I served your grandmother for many years, and I felt the shift the moment you crossed onto this land. I have been waiting a long time for this night." Elena stepped forward despite Grace's warning glance. Something about the old man's calm certainty told her he meant no harm, and after everything she had just read, she found herself desperate for answers only someone like him might provide. "Felt the shift? What do you mean?" Arthur's gaze dropped briefly to the wooden box she carried, before returning to her face. "May I come in? What I have to tell you is not meant for a doorstep conversation, and certainly not for anyone who might be listening from the trees." Elena hesitated only a moment before stepping aside to let him pass. He moved through the cottage with the familiarity of someone who had visited many times before, settling into a worn chair by the cold hearth, as though he had claimed that particular seat for decades. Grace lit a fire while Elena sat across from him, the wooden box resting on her knees. "You knew my grandmother well," Elena said. It was not quite a question. "Better than most," Arthur confirmed. "Beatrice and I spent 40 years piecing together a history that most of the wolf kingdoms have worked very hard to forget. She trusted me with parts of it that even you, I suspect, have not yet found in that box." "Then tell me," Elena said, leaning forward. "Tell me what you know." Arthur studied her for a long moment, as though weighing how much truth she was ready to carry. Finally he began to speak, his voice settling into the rhythm of a man reciting something he had told himself many times in preparation for this exact conversation. "Long before there were Alpha Kings, before packs carved up the wilderness into competing territories, there was a single bloodline that held the wolf kingdoms together. The first Luna, as the old stories call her, was not simply the mate of a powerful alpha. She was a source of authority in her own right, recognized by every pack across the land, capable of commanding loyalty that transcended individual territories. When conflicts arose between packs, it was her judgment that settled them, not the strength of any single alpha's claws." "That sounds like a children's story," Elena said, though she said it without conviction, the documents in her lap already suggesting otherwise. "Most powerful truths get told as children's stories eventually," Arthur said. "It makes them easier for those in power to dismiss." "But the authority was real, Elena, and it was passed down through her bloodline for generations, recognized by ancient law that still technically exists, buried in old council records that most modern alphas have never bothered to read because it does not serve them to acknowledge a power older than their own crowns. And you believe I am part of that bloodline?" "I do not simply believe it," Arthur said. "Your grandmother spent decades confirming it, tracing your family's lineage back through records scattered across a dozen different pack archives, most of them nearly destroyed by time and deliberate neglect. The mark on your shoulder is not decoration, child. It is confirmation, carried by every direct descendant of the first Luna for as long as records have been kept." Elena's hand moved unconsciously to her left shoulder, feeling the familiar shape of the birthmark through the fabric of her dress. "Why would this be hidden? If it's true, if this authority exists, why would no one know about it?" Arthur's expression grew grave. Because power that no individual alpha controls is a threat to every alpha who currently holds it. Centuries ago, as the pack territories grew and competing kings consolidated their own authority, they found it convenient to erase the memory of a bloodline that could, by ancient law, override their decisions. Records were destroyed. Stories were reframed as myth. Anyone who spoke too loudly about the old law found themselves quietly removed from positions of influence. Or worse, your grandmother knew this. She kept her research secret for exactly that reason, protecting your family from a truth that powerful people would prefer remained buried. The fire crackled in the silence that followed, and Elena found herself thinking of the kneeling, of Damien's cold command in front of the entire court, of Celine's fingers under her chin. If what Arthur said was true, then the humiliation she had suffered was not simply a personal cruelty. It was, in some strange way, a collision between an old power neither of them had fully understood and a new order built entirely on ignoring it. "Does Damien know?" she asked quietly. "I doubt it," Arthur said. "Very few people alive still remember the old law in any detail. Your grandmother was one of perhaps a handful across the entire Wolf Kingdoms who understood its full significance. I do not believe your husband married you knowing what you carried in your blood. I believe he married you because Holomir offered a convenient political alliance, nothing more." Elena absorbed this in silence, turning the information over in her mind, testing its weight against everything she thought she understood about her own life. 5 years of marriage, built on a truth neither of them had known existed. 5 years of being treated as a useful political asset, when she might have been, all along, something far more significant. "What does this mean for me now?" she finally asked. "If this bloodline carries the authority you describe, what am I supposed to do with it?" Arthur's eyes softened slightly, the first hint of something like sympathy crossing his weathered face. "That, child, is a question only you can answer. The old law grants you standing that few in this world can claim. It does not grant you an army, or a throne already built and waiting. Authority recognized by ancient law still requires those who hold power today to acknowledge it, and there is no guarantee they will do so willingly, especially not men like your husband, who has clearly grown comfortable holding power without question. Then how do I make them acknowledge it?" "Carefully," Arthur said, "and not alone. There are others scattered across these territories who remember the old law, who have waited years for a sign that the bloodline still lived. I can help you find them, if you are willing to walk a path that will be far harder than simply accepting the life you have already lost." Elena looked down at the wooden box in her lap, at the careful, patient research her grandmother had compiled across a lifetime, work that had waited, it seemed, for exactly this moment to matter. She thought of the guards standing loyal watch outside, despite having nothing left to gain from their loyalty. She thought of Grace, who had followed her into exile without hesitation. She thought of the court that had watched her kneel, believing she had nothing left to offer the world beyond quiet submission. "I am willing," she said, and her voice, when it emerged, carried a steadiness that surprised even her. "Tell me everything. Tell me where to begin." Arthur smiled for the first time since he had arrived, a small, tired expression that nonetheless carried genuine warmth. "Then we begin with the records your grandmother could never quite complete. There is an archive 3 days' ride from here, in the ruins of what was once the old council seat before the current territories divided the land. If any proof exists that would satisfy skeptical alphas beyond your grandmother's private notes, it will be there. And if the records have been destroyed, like you said the powerful ones wanted, then we find another way," Arthur said simply. "Your grandmother did not spend 40 years on this because she expected it to be easy, Elena. She spent 40 years on it because she believed, eventually, someone would need this truth badly enough to fight for it. I think that someone is you." Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters of the old cottage, and somewhere far in the distance, carried on that same restless wind, came the sound of hooves against the forest road, moving fast, moving toward them. Grace was at the window in an instant. "Riders," she said sharply. 4 of them, maybe 5, moving fast, my lady, and not bothering to hide the sound of their approach." Elena rose immediately, the wooden box clutched tight against her chest, her heart hammering, as the sound of hooves grew steadily louder in the darkness outside. The riders burst into the clearing before Elena or Grace could decide whether to run or stand their ground, and for one terrible heartbeat, Elena believed Damien had sent soldiers to drag her back to Moonfire Castle by force. Then the lead rider pulled back his hood, and she recognized the weathered face of Edward, the captain of her own personal guard, from her years as Luna, a man who had served her loyally since her wedding day. "My lady," Edward said, swinging down from his horse before it had fully stopped, his breath ragged from hard riding. "Thank the moon we found you, before anyone else did." "Edward!" Elena's hand went to her chest, relief and confusion tangling together. "What are you doing here? How did you even know where to look?" "Grace sent word to my brother before you left the castle grounds," Edward said, glancing apologetically at the young attendant. "She thought you might need protection beyond what 2 guards could provide, given everything that happened in the hall." Grace had the grace to look slightly sheepish. "I did not think it wise for you to travel with so little protection, my lady, especially not once word of your departure reaches the wrong ears." Elena felt a flicker of gratitude cut through her lingering alarm. "And has word reached the wrong ears already?" Edward's expression darkened. "That is the other reason we rode so hard tonight. Word from the castle says, the king has sent riders in 3 directions searching for you, though not, I think, out of concern for your well-being. Celine has been telling anyone who will listen that your departure proves you never truly accepted the bond between the king and his true mate, that your absence is an admission of failure rather than a woman defending her dignity." Arthur, who had risen from his chair by the fire during the commotion, studied the newly arrived guards with careful, appraising eyes. "Then we have less time than I hoped," he said quietly. "If Damien's riders are searching in 3 directions, it is only a matter of days before someone thinks to check a cottage belonging to the Luna's own family." Elena turned to him. "You said there was an archive, 3 days' ride from here." "There is," Arthur confirmed. "But traveling there now, with search parties combing the countryside, carries real risk." "Staying here carries risk too," Elena said, and she was surprised by how quickly the decision formed in her mind. How little hesitation she felt once the choice presented itself clearly. "I did not leave Moonfire Castle to hide in my grandmother's cottage waiting to be found. I left to understand what I am, and now that I have begun to understand it, I do not intend to stop simply because the path forward is difficult." Edward exchanged a glance with the second guard who had ridden with him from the castle, a younger man named Felix, and something like quiet approval passed between them. They had served Elena long enough to recognize the particular set of her jaw when a decision had been made, a look that had preceded some of the wisest strategic choices of her time as Luna. "Then we ride at first light," Edward said, "before the search parties think to expand their range this far east." They spent the remaining hours before dawn preparing, packing what supplies the cottage could offer, along with what Edward and Felix had carried, while Arthur carefully wrapped Beatrice's collected documents in oiled cloth to protect them from the journey ahead. Elena found herself grateful for the practical work, for the way it kept her hands and mind occupied against the deeper uncertainty, churning beneath the surface of every decision she was making. As the first gray light crept over the eastern hills, Elena stood once more in the overgrown garden of her grandmother's cottage, looking back at the small stone structure that had sheltered her through the strangest night of her life. She thought of everything she had learned within those walls, of the bloodline she had not known she carried, of the old law that might yet reshape everything she believed about her place in the world. "There is something else you should consider before we leave," Arthur said, coming to stand beside her as the others finished loading the horses. "If you truly intend to pursue this path, there can be no half measures. Once word spreads that a descendant of the first Luna has emerged and begun asserting her claim, every alpha king in these territories will take notice, some with curiosity, others with genuine alarm at what it might mean for their own authority. You cannot walk this road quietly, Elena. Eventually, you will have to walk it in the open, and there will be no retreating from that choice once it is made." Elena considered this, watching the sunrise paint the valley in soft gold light. "What would you have me do instead? Return to Moonfire and beg Damien for forgiveness? Accept whatever role Celine decides to leave me?" "No," Arthur said firmly. "I only want you to understand fully what you are choosing, before the choice becomes impossible to undo." "I understand," Elena said, and she found that she meant it completely, without the hesitation she might have expected from herself only 2 days earlier. I have spent 5 years shaping my life around what other people needed from me. I built alliances for Damien. I softened the edges of his ambition. I gave up my own family's independence to secure a peace that ultimately meant nothing to the man I made those sacrifices for. I am done building my life around other people's decisions. Back at Moonfire Castle, though Elena could not know it as she rode east into the rising sun, Damien sat alone in his private study, staring at a letter Elena had left behind, delivered to his desk by a servant only that morning. It was brief, formal in tone, containing none of the anger or grief he might have expected from a woman he had publicly humiliated only 2 nights before. The letter stated, in careful and measured language, that Elena formally renounced her title as Luna of the Moonfire Pack, effective immediately, and that she released Damien from any obligation their marriage bond might have created toward her. It offered no explanation for her departure beyond what he already knew, and it made no demand for compensation or consideration in return. Damien read the letter 3 times, each reading leaving him more unsettled than the last. He had expected fury from Elena, or perhaps tears, some emotional response he could manage or dismiss depending on his mood. He had not expected calm, formal renunciation, delivered with the same measured composure she had shown while kneeling on the stone floor of his own great hall. "She has left nothing to negotiate," he said aloud to the empty study, and found that the realization troubled him more than he was willing to admit even to himself. Celine entered a few minutes later, drawn by whatever instinct told her when Damien's mood had shifted into territory that required careful management. She read the letter over his shoulder, her expression carefully arranged into something like sympathy that did not quite mask the satisfaction underneath. "This is good news," she said softly, resting a hand on his shoulder. "She has made this simple for everyone. There is no messy divorce to negotiate, no lingering claim on your throne. She has given you exactly what you need to move forward." Damien did not answer immediately. He set the letter down on his desk and stared out the window toward the eastern hills, where the morning light was climbing steadily higher. Something about Elena's easy departure nagged at him, a small, persistent doubt he could not fully articulate, though he pushed it aside, as he had pushed aside so many small doubts over the past year, telling himself that whatever unease he felt was simply the natural discomfort of ending a 5-year marriage, nothing more significant than that. "You are right," he said finally, though his voice lacked full conviction. "This simplifies things considerably." Celine smiled and pressed closer, already speaking of the formal ceremony that would need to be arranged to properly install her as Luna, of the alliances with the Silverfang territory that would now be secured through her elevated position, of the future stretching ahead of them, unencumbered by any lingering claim from Damien's former wife. Damien listened, nodding at the appropriate moments, but his eyes kept drifting back to the letter on his desk, to Elena's careful, unhurried handwriting, and to the strange, quiet certainty in her words that suggested a woman who had not simply given up, but who had instead found something new to walk toward, something Damien could not yet begin to imagine. He did not know, as he sat in his study accepting what he believed was a clean and simple ending, that he had just released the one person whose absence would eventually unravel everything he had built his kingship upon. A crossbow bolt splintered the tree bark inches from Elena's head, and the forest exploded into chaos before she had time to process what was happening. Edward's horse reared with a scream, throwing him hard against the ground, while Felix wheeled his own mount toward the tree line, shouting a warning that came a half-second too late to matter. "Ambush!" Grace shouted, already sliding from her horse and pulling Elena down with her, using the animal's body as makeshift cover. "My lady, stay low." They had been 3 days into their journey toward the old archive Arthur had described, deep in a stretch of forest that belonged to no single pack's clearly defended territory, exactly the kind of lawless borderland where bandits and mercenaries were known to operate freely. Elena had known the risk when they chose this route, a shorter path that avoided the main roads where Damien's search parties were most likely to be watching, but knowing a risk and living through its arrival were entirely different experiences. Figures emerged from the tree line, 6 of them by Elena's quick count, dressed in mismatched leather armor that marked them as hired mercenaries rather than any organized pack's soldiers. Their leader, a broad-shouldered man with a jagged scar across his left cheek, stepped forward with a crossbow still raised, his eyes scanning the small group with the calculating look of a man assessing potential value rather than simple bloodlust. We don't want trouble with travelers, the scarred man called out, though his tone suggested precisely the opposite. Hand over your coin, and your horses, and we let you walk away from this. Edward had recovered from his fall, and now stood between the mercenaries and Elena, sword drawn, blood trickling from a cut above his eyebrow. You'll have neither, he growled, though Elena could see the strain in his stance, the awareness that 6 against 3, with Elena and Arthur unable to fight, made poor odds for a straightforward confrontation. The scarred man's eyes shifted past Edward toward Elena, and something in his expression sharpened with sudden interest. Wait, he said slowly, that mark on her wrist, that's a royal signet, isn't it? This isn't just any traveler. He smiled, an expression with nothing warm in it. Seems we've caught ourselves something more valuable than horses. Elena's blood went cold as she realized the ring she still wore, a small band marking her former status as Luna, had betrayed exactly the kind of value that would make this encounter far more dangerous than a simple robbery. Mercenaries who recognized royal connections did not simply take coin and leave. They took hostages, sold information, or worse. Take the ring, she said quickly, pulling it from her finger and holding it out. Take it, and let us go. Oh, I don't think so, the scarred man said, motioning 2 of his men forward. A ring like that means someone important will pay handsomely to have you return safely. Or perhaps not so safely, depending on who exactly you belong to. Edward moved to intercept the advancing mercenaries, his sword flashing in a defensive arc that forced the first man back with a curse. But the second circled wide, and Felix, still mounted, found himself facing 2 more attackers converging from the opposite direction. Grace pulled a hidden blade and positioned herself protectively in front of Elena, her small frame betraying nothing of the fierce determination in her eyes. Elena felt the moment shift, felt the fear in her chest tighten into something sharper and more desperate as she watched Edward take a shallow cut across his forearm, as she watched Felix's horse stumble under the pressure of 2 attackers, closing in from either side. She thought, with sudden clarity, of everything Arthur had told her, of the authority that supposedly ran through her bloodline, and some instinct she could not name told her that whatever power she carried would remain useless forever if she did not reach for it now, in this moment, when it mattered most. She closed her hand into a fist and felt the birthmark on her shoulder flare with a heat unlike anything she had experienced before, a warmth that spread rapidly down her arm and through her chest, gathering into something that demanded release. Enough, she said, and the word came out with a force that surprised even her, carrying a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very air of the clearing. Every mercenary froze. Edward's sword arm halted mid-swing. Felix's attackers stumbled back a step, their faces suddenly uncertain. Even the horses went still, their earlier panic replaced by something like reverent stillness, as though some ancient part of their nature recognized a command that predated every modern hierarchy they had ever known. The scarred leader's confident sneer faltered, replaced by genuine confusion as he tried to understand why his own men had stopped moving, why his own limbs suddenly felt heavier than they should, resistant to his intention to press forward. Elena did not fully understand what she had done, only that something in her voice had carried a weight beyond ordinary command, something that had reached past conscious thought and touched the deepest instincts every wolf carried, instincts about hierarchy and submission that ran older than any individual pack's laws. She felt the power humming through her still, waiting, responsive to her will, in a way she had never experienced before. Leave, she said, and again the word carried that same strange resonance, less a request than an undeniable truth being spoken into existence. Leave now, and do not return to this stretch of forest. The mercenaries exchanged uncertain glances, their earlier confidence visibly crumbling under an instinct they could not name or resist. One by one, they backed away, their leader last of all, his scarred face twisted with confusion, and something close to fear, as he stared at Elena, as though seeing her clearly for the first time. "What are you?" he breathed, before turning and disappearing into the tree line with his men close behind, their retreat leaving the small clearing eerily quiet, except for the ragged breathing of Elena's own companions. Edward lowered his sword slowly, staring at Elena with an expression that mixed disbelief with something like awe. "My lady," he said carefully, "what just happened?" Elena looked down at her own hands, still trembling slightly from the strange power that had moved through her, and found she had no simple answer to offer him. The warmth in her shoulder had faded to a gentle pulse, still present but no longer demanding release, as though it had done exactly what it needed to do, and now waited patiently for whatever came next. Arthur, who had watched the entire confrontation from beside the horses, approached slowly, his weathered face alight, with an expression Elena had not seen from him before, something between vindication and wonder. The old law was never simply about legal standing, he said quietly, almost to himself. I had forgotten, or perhaps never fully believed, that the bloodline carried true power, not merely ceremonial authority. Beatrice always suspected as much, but she never lived to see it confirmed. I don't understand what I did, Elena admitted, her voice unsteady. I simply spoke, and they stopped. All of them, even the horses. The First Luna's authority was said to extend beyond ordinary command, Arthur explained, his voice carrying the careful tone of a scholar finally witnessing proof of a theory he had spent decades studying, without ever expecting confirmation. It reaches into the deepest instincts every wolf carries, the ancient recognition of a hierarchy that predates individual pack structures. You commanded obedience not through fear or force, but through something those men's own nature could not resist, no matter how they might have wanted to. Grace, still holding her blade at the ready despite the mercenaries' retreat, stared at Elena with newfound wonder. My lady, I have served you for 2 years, and I never imagined. Neither did I, Elena said softly, cutting her off, still trying to process the magnitude of what had just occurred. She flexed her fingers, feeling the last traces of that strange warmth fade from her shoulder, and found herself both exhilarated and deeply unsettled by what she had just discovered about herself. They made camp early that evening, farther from the ambush site than Edward would have preferred to travel given his injuries, but none of them felt safe remaining close to where the mercenaries had fled. As the fire crackled against the gathering darkness, Elena sat apart from the others, turning her hands over in the firelight, searching for some visible sign of the power that had moved through her so unexpectedly. Felix approached cautiously, offering her a plate of the modest meal Grace had prepared from their dwindling supplies. My lady, he said, settling nearby with the careful deference of a man reassessing everything he thought he understood about the woman he served. May I ask you something? Of course, Elena said. Do you think you could do it again? What you did back there? Elena considered the question seriously, remembering the sensation of the power gathering and releasing, the strange certainty that had guided her without conscious instruction. I don't know, she admitted honestly. It felt less like a skill I chose to use, and more like something that was already there, waiting for the right moment to emerge. Whether I can call on it deliberately, whether I can control it fully, I have no idea. Then perhaps that is something we discover together, Arthur said, settling across the fire from her, his expression thoughtful. There is a reason the old law spoke of the First Luna's authority as something that grew and strengthened with recognition and practice, rather than something that arrived complete and fully formed. What you experience today may only be the beginning of what you are capable of, Elena, if you are willing to learn to understand it properly. Elena looked up at the star-filled sky stretching above the small clearing, thinking of the woman who had knelt on cold stone only days before, believing herself powerless against the forces arrayed against her. That woman felt impossibly distant now, replaced by someone who had just discovered a strength buried so deep within her own blood that she had lived her entire life without ever suspecting its existence. Then teach me, she said, turning back to Arthur with quiet resolve burning steady in her eyes. Teach me everything you know, because I do not intend to let this power remain a mystery, not when there are people in this world who would use far worse power against those who cannot defend themselves. The fire crackled between them, and somewhere in the darkness beyond the clearing's edge, a lone wolf's howl rose into the night sky, long and clear, carrying farther than any ordinary call had any right to travel, as though the ancient forest itself had recognized something significant had just awakened within its borders. Smoke rose from the ruins ahead of them, and Elena's stomach dropped as she realized the old archive Arthur had promised might already be lost. They had ridden hard for 2 more days after the ambush, pushing their tired horses along overgrown paths that had not seen regular travel in decades, and now, cresting the final hill before their destination, They found not the quiet stone repository Arthur had described, but a scene of recent destruction, thin trails of smoke still curling from blackened timber. "Someone got here first," Edward said grimly, already scanning the tree line for signs of continued danger. Arthur's face had gone pale. This cannot be a coincidence. Very few people know this place still exists, let alone what it might contain. They approached cautiously, weapons ready, but found no immediate threat waiting among the ruins, only the aftermath of what appeared to be a deliberate fire, set with enough skill to ensure the old wooden shelving and paper records inside the stone structure would burn completely, while leaving the outer walls largely intact. Elena walked through the wreckage with a growing sense of dread, kicking gently through ash and debris that had once held centuries of carefully preserved history. "If someone burned this place, they knew what it contained," she said quietly, "which means someone already suspected the bloodline might surface again. Or someone simply wanted to ensure it never could," Arthur replied, crouching beside a partially burned chest near the back wall, prying it open with careful hands. Inside, a handful of documents had survived, protected by the metal lining of the chest from the worst of the flames. He lifted them out with the delicate care of a man handling something sacred, scanning the surviving text with visible relief. Not everything is lost, but someone clearly wanted this archive destroyed before it could be used against them. A soft sound from the tree line beyond the ruins brought every member of the group instantly alert, weapons raised, until a figure stepped into view, with both hands visible and open, a clear gesture of peaceful intent. She was an older woman, perhaps 60 years, with silver hair pulled back in a practical braid, and sharp eyes that missed nothing as she surveyed the group standing among the ruins. "You are looking for answers that most people spend their whole lives avoiding," the woman said, her voice carrying the rough confidence of someone long accustomed to living outside the protection of any organized pack. "My name is Eleanor. I have been watching this place for 3 days, ever since the men who burned it left. I was beginning to think no one else would come looking for what they destroyed." "You watched them burn it and did nothing?" Edward asked, his tone sharp with suspicion. "I watched 12 armed men with orders from someone powerful enough to command that kind of loyalty," Eleanor said evenly. "One old woman alone would have accomplished nothing except adding her own body to the wreckage. I chose instead to wait and see who might come searching for what was lost, hoping they might be worth trusting with what I already know." Arthur studied her carefully, some flicker of recognition crossing his weathered features. "Eleanor of the border settlements, I have heard your name before, though I confess I believed you a legend more than a living person. Legends have a way of surviving longer than the people who create them," Eleanor said with a faint, tired smile. "But I am quite real, Arthur, and I suspect you already know why I have spent the last 20 years living quietly at the edges of pack territory, rather than within them." "You know the old law," Elena said, understanding dawning as she watched the exchange between the two elders. "You're one of the others Arthur mentioned, the ones who remember." Eleanor turned her sharp gaze fully toward Elena for the first time, studying her with an intensity that made Elena feel as though every detail of her bearing was being carefully catalogued and assessed. "You carry yourself differently than I expected," she said finally. "Most descendants who eventually discover their bloodline arrive frightened, uncertain, overwhelmed by a truth too large for their previous understanding of themselves. You arrive like someone who has already begun to accept what she is." "I had a rather forceful introduction to what I'm capable of," Elena said, thinking of the mercenaries who had frozen at the sound of her voice. Eleanor's eyebrows rose with interest. "Already? That is faster than most. The power usually takes months, sometimes years, to fully awaken in someone raised without knowledge of their true heritage. Whatever triggered it in you must have been significant." "A moment of genuine desperation," Arthur offered. "Perhaps that is exactly what the old law requires, a need urgent enough to break through generations of dormancy." Eleanor nodded slowly, filing this information away with the careful attention of a woman, accustomed to gathering and preserving knowledge others had long since abandoned. "Come," she said, gesturing toward a narrow path leading deeper into the forest beyond the ruined archive. "There is a settlement not far from here, hidden well enough that it has survived undisturbed for many years. Others like myself have gathered there, people who remember the old law, who have waited a long time for a sign that the bloodline still lived in this world. I think it is time they met the woman who caused it to reawaken." The settlement, when they reached it an hour later, surprised Elena with its scale. She had expected perhaps a handful of elderly scholars living in careful obscurity, but instead found a small, thriving community of perhaps 40 people, ranging from elders like Eleanor to young families raising children among simple wooden homes, arranged around a central clearing. Every face that turned toward their arriving group carried the same careful, assessing curiosity Eleanor had shown at the archive ruins. "Who are these people?" Elena asked quietly as they walked through the settlement, aware of the many eyes following their progress. "Wolves who were exiled from their packs for reasons that had little to do with genuine wrongdoing," Eleanor explained. "Some spoke too openly about the old law and found themselves labeled troublemakers by alphas who preferred the topic remain forgotten. Others simply refused to accept unjust treatment within their own packs and paid the price for their defiance. Over the years, this place became a refuge for anyone who found themselves rejected by the rigid hierarchies that govern most territories." A tall man with graying hair and a warrior's bearing approached from the center of the settlement, his eyes moving over Elena with the same careful appraisal Eleanor had shown, though his expression carried a harder edge of skepticism. "Eleanor tells us you claim descent from the first Luna," he said, without preamble. "Forgive me if I require more than a claim before I extend my trust. I am called Gregory, and I have spent 15 years defending this settlement from those who would prefer it did not exist. I do not offer that protection lightly to strangers." "I understand your caution," Elena said, meeting his skepticism without flinching. "I would offer the same caution in your position, but I did not come here seeking blind trust. I came seeking understanding of a power I only recently discovered I carry, and allies who might help me learn to use it wisely, if such allies exist among your people." Gregory studied her for a long moment, something in her steady response seeming to ease at least a portion of his doubt. "Show me," he said finally. "If you carry what Eleanor believes you carry, show me now, in front of those gathered here, and we will speak further about what comes next." Elena felt a flicker of uncertainty, remembering that her earlier display of power had emerged from desperate necessity rather than deliberate control. She was not certain she could summon it again, simply because it was requested of her. But she thought of everything at stake, of the trust she needed to build with these people, if she hoped to accomplish anything beyond simple survival, and she closed her eyes, reaching inward for the warmth that had flared so unexpectedly in the forest clearing days before. It came more slowly this time, but it came, a gentle heat building in her shoulder and spreading through her chest, responsive now, in a way that suggested Arthur had been right about power that grew stronger with recognition and practice. She opened her eyes and spoke, not a command this time, but a simple, quiet acknowledgement of the gathered crowd's presence, testing whether the resonance she had discovered would answer her intention, even without the sharp edge of desperate need. The response rippled through the clearing immediately. Every wolf present, from the eldest gathered elder to the youngest child playing near the settlement's edge, turned toward her with an expression of instinctive, involuntary attention, as though her voice had reached past ordinary hearing and touched something deeper in each of them. Gregory's skeptical expression shifted into something like stunned recognition, and around the clearing, Elena watched person after person lower their heads slightly, an unconscious gesture of respect that none of them seemed fully aware they were making. "By the moon," Gregory breathed, staring at her with newfound reverence. "It's true. After all these years, it's actually true." Eleanor stepped forward, her weathered face bright with an emotion Elena could only describe as vindicated hope. "Welcome, Elena of Hollowmere," she said formally, her voice carrying clearly across the settlement clearing. "Welcome to a family you did not know you had, and to a fight you did not choose, but which now belongs to you as much as it belongs to any of us, who have waited so long for this exact moment to arrive." Around the clearing, the gathered settlement began to stir with quiet, disbelieving conversation, and Elena felt, for the first time since kneeling on the cold stone floor of Damien's great hall, something that felt distinctly like the foundation of genuine strength beginning to take shape beneath her feet. A goblet shattered against the stone floor of the council chamber, and every conversation in the room stopped at once. Celine stood at the head of the long table, her chest heaving with barely controlled fury, while the assembled alphas from 6 allied territories stared at her, with expressions ranging from shock to poorly concealed disdain. "I asked a simple question," growled an older man in the deep russet robes of the Thornfield pack, his voice steady despite Celine's outburst. I asked what lineage supports your claim to the Luna title, given that the succession laws of this kingdom have always required more than a king's personal preference to formalize a new Luna's standing. It is a reasonable question, and one I intend to have answered before I commit my pack's loyalty to your position. My bond with Damien is the only lineage that matters, Celine snapped, though the sharpness in her voice suggested a woman who felt her footing growing less stable by the moment. The true mate bond supersedes any archaic requirement about bloodline documentation. Does it? The Thornfield Alpha asked mildly. I confess, I was not aware the true mate bond alone had ever been sufficient to secure formal recognition as Luna, in the absence of proper lineage records. Perhaps you could point me toward the precedent. Damien, seated at the head of the table, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes moving between Celine's rising anger and the skeptical faces of alphas whose loyalty he genuinely needed to maintain his own kingdom's stability. 3 months had passed since Elena's departure, 3 months during which he had expected the transition to Celine's formal Luna status to proceed smoothly, backed by his own authority as king. Instead, he found himself facing exactly the kind of resistance he had not anticipated, resistance rooted in questions about legitimacy that he had never needed to answer when Elena held the position, since her Holomere lineage, however politically modest, had never been in doubt. The council does not need to relitigate ancient bureaucratic requirements, Damien said, attempting to steer the conversation back toward calmer waters. I am king. My choice of Luna carries my full authority behind it. Your authority carries weight within your own territory, certainly, said a woman from the Ashwood delegation, her tone carrying careful diplomatic precision, even as her words cut directly to the heart of the growing discomfort in the room. But the alliances between our territories were built on mutual respect for established succession practices. When Elena held the position of Luna, no pack among us ever questioned her legitimacy, because her lineage, however small her birth pack, was properly documented and formally recognized by every relevant council years before your marriage. This situation feels considerably less settled. Celine's composure cracked further at the direct comparison. I am not required to justify myself against a woman who abandoned her own marriage rather than accept her husband's true bond. She did not abandon anything, the Thornfield Alpha said, his voice sharpening now with an edge that suggested his patience had reached its limit. From what I understand, she was made to kneel in front of 300 witnesses and publicly humiliated, before departing, with what I would call remarkable dignity, given the circumstances. I have heard the details from no fewer than 4 separate sources present that evening, and none of the accounts paint a flattering picture of how this transition was handled. The chamber fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by Celine's ragged breathing and the quiet shifting of alphas exchanging glances that spoke volumes about opinions they had clearly discussed, privately long before this meeting convened. Damien felt the full weight of the room's judgment settling on him, and for the first time since the night in the Great Hall, he allowed himself to genuinely consider whether his handling of the situation had been the strategic masterstroke he had once believed it to be. This meeting is adjourned, Damien said abruptly, rising from his seat. We will reconvene tomorrow, once tempers have cooled. The alphas filed out slowly, their murmured conversations trailing behind them, and Damien caught fragments of doubt and concern that unsettled him more than any single direct confrontation might have. When the chamber finally emptied, leaving only himself and Celine, he found himself studying her with an assessing coldness he had not directed toward her since their relationship began. That could have gone better, he said flatly. They are simply testing me, Celine said, though her earlier confidence had visibly diminished. Once I am formally installed, once the ceremony is complete, these questions will fade. They always do. Will they? Damien asked, and something in his tone made Celine look at him sharply. Elena's legitimacy was never questioned in 5 years of marriage, not once. I never had to defend her position to a single allied alpha, not because I demanded their silence, but because there was genuinely nothing to question. I am beginning to wonder whether I underestimated exactly what that stability was worth. Are you suggesting you regret your choice? Celine's voice had gone quiet, dangerous in its stillness. Damien did not answer immediately, and the silence stretched long enough to answer the question more clearly than words might have. He turned instead toward the window, looking out over the same courtyard where Elena had once tended gardens that had, he realized with sudden discomfort, been left untouched and slowly withering in the months since her departure. "I am suggesting," he said finally, choosing his words with careful precision, "that I need this council's continued loyalty to hold this kingdom together, and that loyalty appears far less secure than I assumed it would be, once Elena's presence no longer anchored it. I need you to resolve these questions about your legitimacy, Celine, and I need you to do it quickly, before doubt spreads further than it already has." Celine's expression flickered through several emotions before settling into something calculating and cold. "Perhaps," she said slowly, "the solution is simpler than either of us has considered. If the council requires proper documentation of lineage, then perhaps documentation can be arranged." Damien turned back to face her, his expression sharpening with sudden suspicion. "What do you mean arranged?" "I mean," Celine said, moving closer with the same practiced confidence that had once charmed him so effectively, though now it carried an edge that made him distinctly uneasy, "that records can be created, or altered, by those with sufficient resources and motivation. My family maintains certain connections within the Silverfang archives. It would not be difficult to establish a more favorable lineage, one that would satisfy even the most skeptical Alpha's demands for proper documentation." "You're talking about forgery," Damien said, his voice flat with disbelief. "Falsifying formal succession records." "I am talking about survival," Celine countered sharply, "about securing what we have already begun building together. Do you truly believe the truth will serve us better than a carefully constructed story that satisfies everyone's requirements?" Damien stared at her for a long moment, and something shifted behind his eyes, a recalculation of exactly who this woman was and what she was truly capable of. He had known she was ambitious. He had known she was politically shrewd, in ways that had once seemed like valuable assets rather than warning signs. He had not fully understood, until this exact moment, how far she might be willing to go, and how casually she suggested crossing lines that even his most ruthless advisors had always respected. "No," he said finally, "we will find another way. Falsified records, if discovered, would destroy far more than your legitimacy. They would call into question every decision this kingdom has made since your arrival, and I am not willing to gamble the stability of my entire reign on a lie that could unravel at any moment." Celine's jaw tightened, but she said nothing further, retreating instead into a careful, calculating silence that Damien found more unsettling than her earlier anger had been. She left the chamber without another word, and Damien remained alone, staring out at Elena's withering garden, turning over a growing unease he could no longer fully suppress. That evening, alone in his private study, Damien found himself pulling out Elena's farewell letter again, reading it for perhaps the 20th time since her departure, searching for something in her careful, measured words that he had not noticed during his previous readings. He thought of the doubt now spreading through his own council, of Celine's casual willingness to falsify sacred succession records, of the strange, persistent rumors that had begun reaching him over the past weeks, about unusual gatherings happening in the border territories, about old stories being retold with unusual seriousness, in settlements that had nothing to do with formal pack politics. He did not yet understand what those rumors meant, could not have guessed that they traced back to a small hidden settlement, where a woman he had once called his wife was, at that very moment, beginning to understand the true depth of a power that would eventually reshape everything he believed about the foundations of his own crown. But sitting alone in his study, watching the candles burn low against the gathering darkness outside, Damien found himself troubled by a question he had not allowed himself to ask honestly until now: whether the throne he had worked so hard to secure had ever truly belonged to him alone, or whether it had always depended, in ways he was only beginning to understand, on the quiet strength of the woman he had so carelessly cast aside. A raven struck the window of the settlement's main hall with enough force to crack the glass, and Elena was on her feet before Gregory could even reach the door, her instincts sharpened by months of training that had taught her to treat every disruption as a potential threat until proven otherwise. But the bird, when Gregory retrieved it from the ground outside, carried only a small message tube bound to its leg, sealed with the formal wax insignia of the Royal Council of Alphas, an authority that predated and technically superseded every individual pack's throne, though it had convened so rarely in recent generations that most wolves alive had never witnessed its power exercised. "This is not addressed to me," Gregory said, studying the seal with visible surprise before handing the message directly to Elena. "It bears your name, formally, as descendant of the first Luna. Someone on the council already knows exactly what you are." Elena's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, unrolling the parchment inside to reveal formal, precise handwriting that carried the weight of genuine institutional authority, rather than the casual correspondence she had grown accustomed to during her months in exile. The message summoned her, by name and by acknowledged bloodline, to appear before the full assembled royal council within 30 days, to formally present her claim and allow the gathered alphas of every territory to determine how the old law should be applied given her emergence. "How did they learn of me?" Elena asked, looking up at Arthur and Eleanor, who had both gathered close to read the message over her shoulder. "We have been careful. We have told almost no one beyond this settlement." "Careful is not the same as invisible," Eleanor said grimly. "Word of what happened with those mercenaries in the forest would have spread eventually, whispered from traveler to traveler, until it reached ears connected to more formal channels. And 40 people cannot maintain perfect secrecy forever, no matter how loyal every individual among them might be." Arthur studied the seal more closely, his expression thoughtful. "This is not necessarily bad news, Elena. The council convening on this matter, formally, means they take the old law seriously enough to address it directly, rather than simply ignoring your claim or dismissing it as rumor. That in itself is significant. Or it means they intend to end this before it grows any further," Gregory said darkly. "A formal summons could as easily be a trap as a genuine invitation to be heard fairly. We should consider the possibility that whoever informed the council did so specifically to draw Elena into a controlled setting where her claim could be dismissed or discredited before it gathers wider support." The settlement's main hall fell into tense debate that stretched long into the evening, voices rising and falling as different elders weighed in, with decades of accumulated political wisdom, each offering a different assessment of the risks and opportunities the summons represented. Elena listened carefully to every perspective, absorbing the nuances of council politics she had only begun to understand during her months of training, but ultimately she recognized that the decision, and the consequences that would follow from it, rested with her alone. "I will go," she said finally, once the debate had run its course, and every voice in the hall had turned expectantly toward her. "Whatever risk this summons carries, refusing to appear would carry a greater one. If the council is prepared to formally consider my claim, then I owe it to everyone who has supported me these past months, to stand before them, and make that claim as clearly and confidently as I am able." Eleanor nodded slowly, though her expression remained cautious. "Then we prepare you properly. 30 days is not much time, but it is enough to ensure you walk into that chamber as someone the assembled alphas cannot easily dismiss." The following weeks passed in intense preparation, Elena spending long hours with Arthur, reviewing every surviving fragment of the old law, with Eleanor practicing the careful diplomatic language that formal council proceedings required, with Gregory working to sharpen the control she now held over the strange authority that had awakened within her, teaching her to summon it deliberately, rather than relying on desperate necessity as she had during the forest ambush. She learned that the power responded most reliably to genuine conviction rather than performed confidence, that it required her to fully believe in the legitimacy of what she asked before it would answer her call with its full strength. She practiced in the settlement's central clearing each morning, gathering small groups of residents who volunteered to test her growing command, watching with quiet satisfaction as her control grew steadier and more precise with each passing week. Word of her preparation and of the approaching council summons spread beyond the settlement's borders despite their best efforts at discretion, carried by travelers and traders who moved between territories, exchanging news along with their goods. By the time the 30 days drew to a close, Elena had learned that her name was being spoken in taverns and gathering halls across half the Wolf Kingdoms, some speaking with hopeful curiosity, others with the dismissive skepticism of people who had heard too many false claims of ancient authority over the years to take any new rumor seriously. She traveled to the council seat with a small delegation, Arthur and Eleanor accompanying her as advisors, Gregory leading a modest but carefully selected group of settlement warriors, chosen more for their steady discipline than for any intent to appear threatening. Edward and Felix, having recovered fully from their injuries in the forest ambush, rode alongside them still, their loyalty to Elena having only deepened through everything they had witnessed during her months of transformation. The council seat itself occupied a neutral territory belonging to no single pack, an ancient stone structure built centuries earlier specifically for gatherings that required every alpha to meet as equals, rather than as guests within a rival's domain. Elena felt the weight of history pressing down on her as she approached its towering entrance, aware that she was about to walk into a chamber that had witnessed the resolution of conflicts and the confirmation of authorities for longer than any individual pack territory had existed in its current form. Inside, the council chamber proved even more imposing than she had imagined, a vast circular room with tiered seating arranged around a central floor, every seat occupied by an alpha or their formal representative from territories stretching across the entire breadth of the Wolf Kingdoms. Elena recognized several faces from her years as Luna, though most regarded her now with the careful, assessing curiosity of strangers, rather than the familiar warmth of old acquaintances. At the center of the tiered seating, in a position of clear prominence, sat an elderly woman with silver hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing, flanked by two similarly aged advisors, who together comprised what Elena understood to be the council's presiding leadership, the closest thing to formal authority the ancient institution still maintained. The elderly woman rose as Elena entered, her voice carrying easily through the chamber's careful acoustics. "Elena of Hollowmere," she said formally. "You have been summoned before this council to present your claim of descent from the first Luna, and to allow this assembled body to determine, according to ancient and binding law, what standing that claim carries within our current political order. Do you understand the formal nature of these proceedings, and do you consent to be bound by whatever determination this council ultimately reaches?" Elena felt every eye in the chamber fixed on her, felt the weight of a decision that would shape the entire remainder of her path forward, and she thought, briefly, of the woman who had knelt on cold stone in Damien's great hall, believing herself powerless against forces far beyond her control. That woman felt impossibly distant now. "I understand," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber without hesitation, "and I consent." The presiding elder nodded slowly, gesturing toward the empty center of the circular floor. "Then step forward, child of the first Luna's line, and let this council witness what you claim to be." Elena walked forward into the center of the chamber, aware of every gaze following her movement, aware that somewhere among the gathered alphas, word of this proceeding would already be traveling back toward Moonfire Castle, toward a king and his chosen mistress, who had never imagined the woman they discarded would one day stand at the heart of the Wolf Kingdom's oldest surviving institution, prepared to reclaim a legacy far greater than any single throne had ever offered her. The chamber doors burst open before the presiding elder could formally begin the proceedings, and Damien strode in with Celine close behind him, both of them clearly having ridden hard and fast the moment word of the council summons reached Moonfire Castle. The gathered alphas turned in surprise, murmurs rippling through the tiered seating, as the king, who had never previously bothered to attend a full council session in 5 years of his reign, now arrived uninvited to a proceeding that directly concerned the wife he had publicly humiliated months before. "I was not aware Moonfire's king had been summoned to these proceedings," the presiding elder said coolly, her expression betraying none of the surprise rippling through the rest of the chamber. "This is a formal inquiry into a bloodline claim, not a matter requiring the presence of every interested party's personal grievances." "I have every right to be present," Damien said, his voice carrying the practiced authority of a man accustomed to commanding rooms, though Elena noted a tension in his bearing that had not existed during their years together as husband and wife. "Elena remains connected to my kingdom's political standing, regardless of her departure, and any determination this council reaches will directly affect alliances I have spent years building." The presiding elder studied him for a long moment before gesturing toward an empty section of seating, reserved for observers rather than formal participants. "You may observe, but you will not interrupt these proceedings, King Damien. This is Elena's claim to present, and this council's determination to reach, not a negotiation, subject to your input." Damien's jaw tightened, but he took the offered seat without further argument, Celine settling beside him, with an expression that mixed careful composure with poorly concealed anxiety. Elena felt their presence like a weight pressing against her chest, But she forced herself to focus on the task before her, on the careful preparation Arthur and Eleanor had guided her through over the preceding weeks. "Continue," the presiding elder said, turning back to Elena. "Present your evidence to this council." Elena began methodically, presenting first the surviving documents from her grandmother's research, then the fragments recovered from the burned archive, tracing her lineage back through 6 generations of careful record-keeping that connected her family, however circuitously through political marriages and shifting pack allegiances, directly to the first Luna's original bloodline. Several alphas leaned forward with genuine interest as she spoke, while others maintained careful, skeptical expressions, clearly waiting for weaknesses in her presentation that they could exploit. "Documentation alone has been forged before," interrupted an alpha, from a territory Elena did not immediately recognize, his tone carrying open skepticism. "Paper and ink prove nothing definitively, particularly given how conveniently this claim has emerged only months after your very public and humiliating departure from Moonfire's throne." Celine's expression flickered with something like satisfaction at the challenge, and Elena caught Damien glancing toward her with an unreadable expression that suggested even he was uncertain how this confrontation would ultimately resolve. "You are correct that documentation alone cannot fully prove this claim," Elena said calmly, refusing to let the challenge rattle her composure, "which is why the old law recognized a second, more definitive form of proof, one that cannot be forged or falsified through any deliberate deception." She held out her hand, and though every instinct told her this moment carried more weight than any she had faced since the forest ambush months earlier, she found herself surprisingly calm as she reached inward for the power that had grown steadily more responsive to her deliberate call over her months of careful training. "I do not ask this council to simply believe my documented claim," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber. "I ask you to witness what that bloodline carries." The warmth built in her shoulder and spread through her chest with familiar, practiced ease, and she released it, not as a desperate command, but as a controlled, deliberate demonstration, her voice carrying that same strange resonance that had once frozen mercenaries in a forest clearing and stilled an entire settlement's clearing full of skeptical wolves. "Rise," she said simply, addressing the entire chamber, "if you recognize the authority of the first Luna's bloodline in this room." The response rippled through the chamber immediately, and without exception. Every alpha present, from the presiding elder to the youngest formal representative seated in the outer tiers, rose from their seats as one, an instinctive, unconscious movement that none of them appeared able to resist, despite the clear surprise crossing many of their faces. Even the skeptical alpha who had challenged her documentation moments before found himself standing, his expression torn between disbelief and dawning, reluctant recognition. Only Damien and Celine, seated in the observer section reserved for those without formal voting standing, remained partially seated, though Elena noticed Damien's own hand gripping the arm of his chair with white-knuckled tension, as though some part of him fought against the same instinctive pull that had moved every other wolf in the chamber. The presiding elder lowered herself slowly back into her seat, her expression carrying genuine awe, rather than the careful political calculation she had maintained throughout the earlier proceedings. "In 60 years serving this council," she said quietly, her voice carrying through the now hushed chamber, "I have never witnessed a demonstration of the old authority. I believed, as most of us here believed, that it existed only in old stories, exaggerated across generations, until fact and legend became indistinguishable." "It is not legend," Elena said, allowing the power to settle back into quiet stillness within her, though she remained fully aware of its presence now. A constant, steady warmth, rather than the unpredictable force it had once been. "It is real, and it belongs to a law this council has always technically recognized, even when practical politics made it convenient to forget." Murmurs swept through the chamber, alphas turning to confer quietly with their neighbors, the entire assembly visibly recalculating the significance of what they had just witnessed. The skeptical alpha who had challenged her earlier rose formally to address the presiding elder. "I withdraw my earlier doubt," he said simply. "Whatever documentation may or may not prove, what we have just witnessed cannot be forged or falsified. This is genuine." One by one, other alphas rose to offer similar acknowledgments, some brief and formal, others more elaborate, in their recognition of what Elena's demonstration meant for the old law's continued relevance in their modern political order. Throughout it all, Elena remained standing at the center of the chamber, watching the transformation of skepticism into acknowledgement with a quiet, steady composure that surprised even herself. Finally, the presiding elder raised her hand, calling the chamber back to order. This council formally recognizes Elena of Hollowmere as legitimate descendant and bearer of the First Luna's ancient authority, binding under the old law that predates and technically supersedes any individual pack's throne. What say this assembled body regarding the proper application of this recognition? A long-waited silence followed, every alpha considering the practical implications of what they were about to formally acknowledge. Then, slowly, deliberately, one alpha after another rose from their seat, moved to the center of the chamber floor, and knelt before Elena, a formal gesture of acknowledgement that carried far more significance than the simple physical posture might have suggested to an outside observer. Elena watched them kneel, one after another, alphas who commanded territories and armies far larger than her own modest Hollowmere birthpack, wolves who had spent their entire lives holding power that answered to no one beyond their own ambition and strength, now bowing formally before a woman who had, only months earlier, been forced to kneel herself in front of a court that believed her powerless. Across the chamber, Damien rose slowly from his seat, his expression a complicated mixture of shock, dawning understanding, and something that looked uncomfortably close to grief, for a mistake he was only now beginning to fully comprehend. Beside him, Celine's face had gone pale, her earlier confidence completely evaporated as she watched the foundation of everything she had worked to secure crumble in real time before the assembled authority of the entire wolf kingdoms. "This cannot be legally binding," Celine said, her voice cracking with desperation as she rose to address the chamber directly, breaking the formal protocol that had governed the proceedings until that moment. "Whatever demonstration this is, it changes nothing about the succession within Moonfire's own territory. Damien remains king there, and I remain his chosen mate." The presiding elder's gaze settled on Celine with cold, formal precision. "You are correct that this council's recognition does not automatically strip any alpha of their individual throne," she said. "But it does formally establish that Elena of Hollowmere holds authority under ancient law, that every pack in these territories is bound to acknowledge and respect, authority that supersedes any individual king's claim when the two come into direct conflict. What that means practically for Moonfire's internal succession is a matter your own pack's council will need to determine, informed by what has just been formally established here today." Damien remained standing amid the kneeling alphas, the only man in the room besides a few remaining observers who had not yet lowered himself in formal acknowledgement, and Elena watched him with an expression that carried no triumph, only a quiet, steady certainty that whatever came next, she would face it as someone whose worth no longer depended on any single man's recognition or approval. "Damien," the presiding elder said, her voice carrying gently formal expectation, "will Moonfire's king acknowledge what this council has formally recognized?" The entire chamber turned to watch him, the weight of the moment pressing down, with an intensity that Elena could see reflected in the tight lines of his face, in the visible struggle playing out behind his carefully guarded expression. She thought of everything that had passed between them, 5 years of partnership followed by months of quiet betrayal, culminating in the cold cruelty of that night in the great hall, when he had commanded her to kneel before a woman, who now stood beside him, with her own composure shattered beyond repair. Slowly, deliberately, Damien lowered himself to one knee, his eyes never leaving Elena's face, and the formal weight of his acknowledgement settled over the chamber, like the closing of a long and painful chapter. Neither of them had fully understood they were writing until this exact moment arrived. Celine fled the chamber before the formal proceedings concluded, pushing past kneeling alphas without waiting for permission or offering any final word, her composure completely abandoned in her rush to escape a room that had just witnessed the complete collapse of everything she had spent years carefully constructing. No one moved to stop her. No one seemed to consider her departure significant enough to interrupt the weightier business still unfolding at the chamber's center. Damien remained kneeling a moment longer than the other alphas had, his head bowed, and when he finally rose, his expression carried none of the confident authority Elena remembered from their years together. He looked, she thought, like a man confronting the full weight of a mistake he could never fully undo, understanding perhaps for the first time that the stability he had built his kingship upon had always depended more on Elena's quiet strength than on his own individual authority. "Elena," he said quietly, stepping forward from the ring of kneeling alphas, his voice pitched low enough that it did not carry beyond the immediate space between them. "I did not understand what I was casting aside. I want you to know that, whatever else you decide about what comes next." Elena studied him for a long moment, searching for anger within herself, and finding, to her own quiet surprise, something closer to distant, settled peace. "I know you didn't understand," she said finally. "That was always part of the problem, Damien. You stopped trying to understand long before that night in the Great Hall. This is simply the moment the consequences of that finally caught up with you." She did not offer forgiveness, but she did not offer cruelty either, and something in her measured response seemed to land with more weight than either extreme might have carried. Damien nodded slowly, stepping back to allow the presiding elder to formally close the proceedings, and Elena watched him return to his seat among the observers, a king who had walked into this chamber believing himself untouchable, and would leave it having witnessed, in the clearest possible terms, exactly how much his own authority had always depended on foundations he had never fully appreciated. In the weeks that followed, word of the council's formal recognition spread rapidly across every territory in the Wolf Kingdoms, carried by travelers and formal messengers alike, reaching even the smallest, most isolated settlements within a matter of days. Elena found herself, almost overnight, transformed from a quietly displaced former Luna into a figure of genuine significance across the entire political landscape, sought after by alphas, eager to secure her favor, approached by pack elders, hoping to understand what her emergence meant, for the ancient laws, they had long assumed, were nothing more than forgotten history. She did not seek a throne of her own, though several territories offered exactly that in the weeks following the council's recognition, hoping to secure her authority for their own political advantage. Instead, working closely with Eleanor, Arthur, and Gregory, she began the careful work of establishing something new, a formal council seat dedicated to preserving and properly applying the old law, ensuring that the authority she carried would serve as a genuine check against the kind of casual cruelty and unchecked power that had once led Damien to believe he could humiliate her without any lasting consequence. The settlement that had once sheltered exiled wolves and forgotten elders grew steadily over the following months, transforming from a hidden refuge into a recognized institution, visited openly now by representatives from territories across the Wolf Kingdoms who came seeking Elena's counsel on matters both large and small. She found the work fulfilling in ways her years as Luna, however genuinely meaningful they had once felt, had never quite achieved, precisely because this new authority answered to principle, rather than to any single man's shifting favor. Moonfire's kingdom, meanwhile, entered a period of visible instability, as the allied territories that had once trusted Damien's leadership without question began reassessing their loyalty in light of everything the council proceedings had revealed. Celine disappeared from public political life entirely within weeks of her flight from the chamber, her ambitions for formal Luna status quietly abandoned as the Silverfang territory that had once supported her own political rise distanced itself from the scandal her overreach had created. Damien remained king, technically, but Elena heard through occasional reports carried by travelers that his council had grown increasingly assertive in checking his individual authority, that decisions which once flowed entirely from his personal judgment now required broader consultation and agreement, a direct consequence of the trust his own allied territories had lost during the months of instability her departure and subsequent recognition had exposed. On a clear morning nearly a year after that painful night in Moonfire's great hall, Elena stood once again in her grandmother's overgrown garden, now carefully tended and restored, watching the sun rise over a valley that had become, in its own quiet way, the true center of a new kind of authority across the Wolf Kingdoms. Grace approached with tea, no longer simply an attendant, but a trusted advisor in her own right, having grown alongside Elena through every stage of the transformation that had reshaped both their lives. "The delegation from Ashwood arrives this afternoon," Grace said, settling beside her on the familiar stone wall. "They wish to formally request your counsel on a border dispute with Thornfield. It seems territories are growing rather accustomed to bringing their disagreements here, rather than settling them through force." Elena smiled, a genuine expression that carried none of the careful composure she had once needed to maintain during her years as Luna. That is precisely what this was always meant to become, she said. A place where authority serves fairness, rather than simply protecting whoever happens to hold the most power in any given moment. She thought, as she often did during these quiet morning moments, of the woman who had knelt on cold stone in Damien's great hall, believing herself powerless against forces arrayed against her. That woman had not disappeared entirely, Elena understood now. She had simply discovered, through months of difficult transformation, that the strength she needed had been present within her all along, waiting patiently in her own blood for the moment she would finally be ready to claim it. Arthur found her later that morning, walking slowly through the garden, with the careful gait of a man whose age had begun to show more clearly with each passing season, though his eyes remained as sharp and observant as ever. "Your grandmother would be proud," he said simply, settling onto the wall beside her. 40 years of careful, patient research, and it led exactly here, to a garden she once tended herself, now restored by the very granddaughter she always hoped would carry her work forward. "I only wish she had lived to see it," Elena said quietly. "Perhaps she did, in her own way," Arthur offered, gesturing toward the valley stretching before them, toward the distant lights of a settlement that had grown from 40 forgotten souls into a thriving community, recognized across every territory in the Wolf Kingdoms. She spent her life believing this moment would eventually arrive, even when she could not know exactly how or when. That kind of faith, I think, carries its own form of witness, even across the distance of years. Elena looked out over the valley, watching the settlement stir to life as morning light spread across its gathered homes, thinking of every royal wolf who had knelt before her in that vast council chamber, of the long, difficult path that had carried her from a moment of complete public humiliation to a position of genuine, hard-won authority that no single alpha's shifting favor could ever again take from her. She had not sought power for its own sake, had never wanted the crown Damien once held, or the throne several territories had offered her in the aftermath of the council's recognition. She had wanted only to understand who she truly was, and in that understanding, she had found something far more lasting than any single kingdom's borders could contain, a legacy that belonged not to her alone, but to every wolf across the territories who deserved to live under authority that served justice, rather than simply protecting whoever happened to hold the most power in any given moment. The morning sun climbed higher over the valley, and Elena rose from the garden wall, ready to begin another day of the patient, meaningful work that had become her true inheritance, carrying forward a legacy that had waited, quiet and steady, in her own blood, for exactly this moment to finally arrive.